Is that Kiefer Sutherland voicing the Nutcracker Prince himself? I mean, yeah, it's a much younger Kiefer Sutherland voicing the character, but Jack Bauer is the Nutcracker Prince? Caution! The following video is an in-depth review of the movie I'm currently reviewing, which means that there will be massive spoilers in the review. If you haven't seen this movie yet, then please feel free to watch this movie first before watching this video. However, if you have already seen this movie, or you just want to know my thoughts on this movie, then keep watching. I had originally reviewed The Nutcracker Prince way back in 2013, which became a turning point for me in terms of making longer and more detailed reviews, although not as detailed as the reviews from the 2.0 series. Hey, I was still in my sophomore phase when it came to reviewing movies. Anyway, at first I wasn't going to revisit this movie again because I thought that I had explained all of my thoughts about this movie in the original review. But then, after rewatching this movie again recently, I've noticed some things in this movie that I didn't notice before, and I wanted to address those things in this new updated review of The Nutcracker Prince. Oh, and by the way, if you want to check out my original review of The Nutcracker Prince, it's still posted up on YouTube for your viewing pleasure. And there's also a chance that I might state some things from my original review, since some of my opinions about this movie hasn't changed much over the years. But enough of that, let's get on with this review. Before I get into this review, I would like to give out a brief history about the Nutcracker itself. The Nutcracker started out as a children's book written by E.T.A. Hoffmann called The Nutcracker and the Mouse King. It was then eventually made into a ballet with music composed by Russian composer Tchaikovsky. Afterwards, there were many adaptations of The Nutcracker being made into movies and television. The Nutcracker Prince happens to be one of those many movie adaptations of The Nutcracker, an animated one at that. It's also one of the most infamous cases of being under the radar that I have ever seen in the animated film industry. This movie came out during a time when there were many other animation companies trying to compete with Disney, and The Nutcracker Prince was one of those movies. It was made by the now defunct Lacewood Productions, and I will admit that there were some moments in this film that were similar in style and tone to any other Disney movie of the time. But for the most part, this movie managed to stand on its own from the usual Disney fare and do something unique and intriguing with the source material. So before I go into more detail about my thoughts about this movie, I would like to give a brief summary of this film. The film starts off with a young girl named Clara attending her family's annual Christmas party and participating in the festivities. Suddenly, her uncle Drosselmeyer comes in with a fantastic gift for the family, a gorgeous little palace that he built himself, and he eventually starts telling Clara the story about Hans the Nutcracker. In this story, Hans was a young man who was living in the palace with his uncle Drosselmeyer, yeah, the same Drosselmeyer who's telling the story, who was the palace's royal clockmaker. One day, unfortunately, when the Mouse Queen and her son tried to eat up the king's blue cheesecake, and Hans and Drosselmeyer ended up capturing most of the Mouse Queen's minions, the Mouse Queen decided to get her revenge. Shosi decided to put a curse upon the king and queen's daughter, Princess Perlipat, by making her ugly, and the only way that the curse could be broken is if a prince bites down the world's hardest nut and feeds the nut to the princess. So after all the princes in the kingdom tried and failed to bite the nut, Hans decided to bite the nut himself, and he succeeds at cracking the nut. But just as Hans is about to take Princess Perlipat's hand in marriage, the Mouse Queen gets her revenge again by cursing Hans and turning him to a nutcracker. This causes the king to get angry at Drosselmeyer, and he ends up banishing Drosselmeyer and the Nutcracker Hans from his kingdom forever. Several years later, Drosselmeyer tells Clara that the only way that Hans will ever turn back into a human again is if he defeats the now deceased Mouse Queen's son, the Mouse King, and wins the hand of a princess. I wasn't too familiar with the story of the Nutcracker when I first watched this film as a child. I only started to learn more about this story when I went to a play about it in high school for a school project. But ever since I watched this movie, I wanted to learn more about the history of the Nutcracker and what elements this movie took from the source material. It's clear that this movie had both remained faithful to the source material while also taking some liberties with the property. I like the fact that the soundtrack of this movie had retained Tchaikovsky's original musical score of the play, as it shows that the people working on this film had great respect for the source material. The soundtrack also made the movie quite unique, as it's rare that I see the music from a play being brought to life in an animated film, and it fits so beautifully with the events going on throughout the movie. As for the film taking some liberties from the source material, the film added in a backstory for both the Mouse King and Hans the Nutcracker, and I think that it gave the film a bit more depth. I always wanted to know more about the Mouse King and the Nutcracker's rivalry with each other, and this film did a good job at giving us an explanation about why the Mouse King and the Nutcracker fight each other. Hans was cursed by the Mouse Queen into becoming a Nutcracker, and the only way that he could change back into a human again is if he defeats the Mouse King, while winning the love of a princess. Kind of like a Beauty and the Beast scenario, except with toys. Another aspect that I liked about the film was the animation. Sure, it's not quite on par with the animation you would see in any Disney film, but for the most part, the animation was pretty solid. I especially loved the scenes where Hans and Clara were dancing with each other in the Toy Kingdom, as the animation was so fluid during these scenes that it felt like we were seeing real-life people dancing to the music. Another scene from the movie that had some pretty solid animation was the flashback segment where Uncle Drosselmeyer was telling Clara the story of how Hans became the Nutcracker. This sequence was quite unusual because it was animated much more differently than the rest of the film. For one thing, the flashback sequence had a more abstract style to the art, as they made the characters look more cartoonish and humorous, as opposed to the rest of the film, which was animated in a realistic and serious style. Now, I know that some people hated this sequence because the bizarre animation was too out of place for this mostly serious film, but I thought that this sequence was quite creative. I liked the fact that the animation during the flashback scenes was done in a different style from the rest of the film, as it helped separate the segment from the real-world scenes in the film. I was intrigued by how the tone has shifted from the flashback sequences to the real-world sequences, as the flashback sequences had a more comical tone, while the real-world sequences had a much darker, somber tone. It was pretty interesting and ironic to me that the more comical flashback sequences had a downer ending with Hans being turned to the Nutcracker and not getting the girl, while the more somber real-world sequences had a happy ending when Hans and Clara get together. Now let's get into the voice acting of this movie. Now I know that I wasn't the only one to be shocked by the fact that Kiefer Sutherland, Jack Bauer from the hit TV show 24, had actually provided the voice for the Nutcracker in this movie. And this movie came out in 1990, a whole decade before 24 came out. Wow, the many things that you can learn from the internet. Anyway, Kiefer Sutherland did a fantastic job at voicing Hans in this movie, as he made Hans sound so shy yet smooth at the same time. It really fits well with Hans' shy and heroic personality, and I really felt the emotional beats that Kiefer Sutherland gives to Hans during the scenes where Hans is upset or angry. Also, who else thought that Kiefer Sutherland made Hans sound so sexy throughout the film? I know over a dozen YouTube commenters think so. Phyllis Diller was another great addition to the film's voice casting. Even though she only had a brief role as the Mouse Queen, it was still one of the most memorable moments in the film due to Phyllis Diller giving the Mouse Queen a commanding yet comical tone during the storybook segments. But one of my most favorite voice acting performances, besides Kiefer Sutherland of course, was Mike McDonald voicing the Mouse King himself. I just love the fact that the Mouse King sounded both hilarious and threatening at the same time, and Mike McDonald brought so much versatility to his voice. I actually laughed out loud during the scenes when the Mouse King was arguing with his mother about what to do with Hans and his uncle, while at the same time, I was cringy and frightened during the scenes when the Mouse King was threatening Clara's life in a more serious way. Now, even though there were many aspects that I enjoy about this film, there were a couple of problems that I had with this film. The most problematic for me was the fact that the movie seemed to rush through certain plot points a bit too quickly. There were times where I felt that the characters weren't fleshed out well enough, and I found myself trying to figure out about some of the characters' backstories in order to understand them a bit better. One of the main issues that I had with the plot of this film was how it dealt with magic. For one thing, we do know that the Mouse Queen was the one who cursed Hans to turn into a Nutcracker, and that the only way Hans could change back into a human being is to defeat the Mouse King. So with that being said, during the scene where Uncle Drosselmeyer, who for some bizarre reason appeared as a ghostly being, showed up inside a clock at Clara's house, he manages to bring the toys to life, including Hans, who was still a Nutcracker. So if that's the case, couldn't Uncle Drosselmeyer make Hans human again at any time during the years when Hans was still a Nutcracker? Or does Hans actually have to defeat the Mouse King for the spell to be completely broken, since it was the Mouse King's mother who did transform Hans into a Nutcracker in the first place? Also, I'm a bit curious about the true nature of Uncle Drosselmeyer himself. According to the flashback sequences, Uncle Drosselmeyer was just a regular clockmaker who managed to find the cure for Princess Perlipat's curse just by looking up the cure in a book. During these flashback sequences, it seemed like he didn't possess any kind of magical powers that could help anyone, and it was only during the present time that he seemed to possess some kind of magical abilities. So, if that's the case, at what point did Uncle Drosselmeyer obtain such magical abilities, and is he a regular human being, or some kind of supernatural being? Who knows? The film wasn't quite specific about who or what Uncle Drosselmeyer was. There was also the issue about how Hans and Clara's relationship developed over the course of the film. I felt that they fell in love with each other a little too quickly, and there wasn't enough build up to the relationship to convince me that they were made for each other. Now, I know that this film was using the typical love at first sight trope you would find in many fairy tales, but come on! So Hans just immediately falls in love with Clara, even though he had just woken up from a frozen state as a Nutcracker after so many years, and he clearly has no idea about what was going on between him and the Mouse King? Okay, it's official. That's probably the quickest romance I ever seen develop on film. Anyway, I would have liked to see more scenes between Clara and Hans and actually have them start off as friends to make their relationship a bit more believable. However, I did like the scene towards the end when Hans offers Clara a chance to stay with him in the Toy Kingdom and become his queen, only to have Clara turn him down. It may have been a very tragic scene, but it actually shows the realism of the situation. Clara had stated in that scene that she literally cannot be with Hans because 1, she wants to follow her dreams and explore the world, and 2, she literally can't survive on candy and sweets alone. I mean, eating nothing but sweets could potentially kill you because of the sugar overload that your body can't handle. But anyway, this scene also shows that Clara wants to grow up and achieve her dreams, and she can't do that in the Toy Kingdom. It sort of reminds me of the Peter Pan and Wendy situation, where Peter Pan wants Wendy to stay in Neverland, but Wendy wants to grow up and she ends up leaving Neverland behind. And now the last thing I want to talk about is the ending. I was a bit confused about what happened at the end of the movie, as the movie seems to suggest that everything that happened to Clara was all real. If that's the case, then how did Hans transform back into a human? The last we saw of Hans was that he was transforming back into a Nutcracker after Clara turned down his offer. So, was the spell broken even after Clara turned him down? I can safely assume that either Hans knows that he couldn't take Clara away from her dreams and this realization helped break the spell, or the spell broke after the Mouse King, who was previously stabbed in the chest by Hans and is bleeding to death, tried to kill Clara, but then fell to his doom before he could effectively kill him. Who knows what happened? Also, I thought that the ending was a little too abrupt. The movie just ended with Hans and Clara meeting each other and Clara just saying, "Hello, Nutcracker." Now, while that was a pretty impressive ending line for the movie, I wanted to see more of Clara and Hans spending time with each other just to see if Hans remembered anything from his time as a Nutcracker or if he had lost his memories. The Nutcracker Prince was rated G, but if we were to re-rate this movie nowadays, it probably would have received a light PG for some violence and one use of the word hell. I was actually pretty shocked by the violence in this film. I mean, technically it was just one scene, but the scene with the Mouse King being stabbed in the chest and having blood leaking out of his wound is quite a daring move for a children's movie. Also, the scene when the Mouse King was trying to kill Clara while he was dying from the wound in his chest is surprisingly intense and scary, and I'm sure that smaller children will freak out at this scene. Originally, I had given the Nutcracker Prince a score of a 9.7 out of 10, but I had decided to lower the score just a little bit to a 9.5 out of 10, only because the lack of character development for the characters and the plot being a bit rushed through was much more glaring this time around. However, despite all that, this was one of the best animated adaptations of the Nutcracker ever made. And yet, I still can't figure out why this movie is so underrated when the animation and the voice acting was so stellar. Hey, if it helps boost the film's popularity, I highly recommend this movie to anyone who is a huge fan of the Nutcracker story, and it's definitely worth watching during the Christmas holidays. Hope you enjoyed my review of the Nutcracker Prince. Also, if you want early access to movie and TV show reviews before I release them on Sunday, then please feel free to support me on Patreon. It's $3 per month for early access to my videos, and if you want to request a movie or TV show for me to review as a patron, then it's $5 per month. You will also get a shout out in my videos, and you will be featured on my Patreon's Wall of Fame list at the end of each video.